You all set, Megan, David, and Scott to get going? Okay. All right, then let's get going. I'll convene our meeting, our joint meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission and members of the City Council Ordinance Committee. Thanks for everyone to join us. I imagine we may still be getting a couple more people joining us tonight. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it? Okay, then we have our agenda as presented. Item 2 is a public forum, and as I've done before, I'm switching up the public forum just a little bit. So anyone who wants to speak to the short-term rental issue, we're doing that public forum after we have the commission discussion, more of the commission discussion. If you'll recall, at our last meeting, we got an update from staff, a pretty thorough update from staff, and we spent quite a bit of time hearing from everybody from the public who wanted to comment on that and to provide other comments. So at this stage, when we get to the short-term rental, which will be item 3, that's really going to be the commission and council discussion as the predominant theme of that one. And then we will pick up with public comment after that. There may be some during it, but we'll have the public forum for that after. So this item 2 public forum is for anything other than short-term rentals. And is there anyone who'd like to speak during the public forum on that? Megan?
I'm not seeing anyone, Andy.
Okay. All right, well, thanks. I can't see anyone from the public who's here, but thanks for your patience on that and your understanding. So then we're on to item 3, which is proposed TDO amendment for short-term rentals. Megan.
Great. Okay, Andy, so at the end of the last meeting, we took down a number of questions and requests for additional information that the committee shared with us for us to follow up on in today's meeting. So we have prepared a presentation, and we also shared with you all a communication that the staff felt like outlined the major policy questions that the committee was interested in discussing, either to kind of reaffirm the direction that we've taken so far with our work on this policy, or to kind of address questions that you heard based on some of the hosts' feedback in the most recent meetings. So we have put together a presentation that helps us to address all of those things. So Andy, I'm happy to share my screen. We did also post this online if the committee would like to look at this individually, or if any members of the public want to look at it. But we thought we would start there by walking through some kind of background information and then data as it relates to those questions, but kind of weave them into the discussion so that we can cover those questions as we get to the pertinent information.
That sounds great. Let me just sort of lay what I think is the groundwork for what we're trying to accomplish today. And that's that we've spent quite a number of meetings going through all of the short-term rental items. We've come up with our, we have our, essentially the chart that shows from the very low impact of somebody trying to do a short-term rental in one of the rooms in their own home, and they're using their home at the same time, all the way to converting, apartment building into all short-term rentals. And we've gone from one extreme to the other, saying what's allowed, what's not allowed, and all the nuances in between. And we've spent quite a bit of time, again, going through each of those scenarios, really honing in on it. And so I think today, and certainly for today, what we're trying to do is step back a little bit, look at the whole picture now, making sure everything makes sense of what we're doing, making sure that we're addressing a lot of the policy issues now that I think we have the structure pretty well in place. And so as Megan has said, at our last meeting, we had a number of different questions that were kind of open at the end of that meeting. And so I think, Megan, that's what you're focusing on now. And then we'll bring it back to the Commission Council to try to hone in on these specific items. Then if there's anything else that people have as well, certainly, but to try to really start honing in and working towards bringing closure to this, because we've done a lot of the groundwork in whichever direction the closure means, but to start bringing closure on this. Okay. Megan, thanks.
Okay. So I'm just going to share these slides then. And again, for the committee members, if you want to be able to see each other at the same time that you're seeing my slides, if you just click your mouse anywhere within your Zoom screen and hit the escape button on your keyboard, it should pop you back out of just viewing my screen and give you the option to be able to see each other as well. So we wanted to, as Andy mentioned, to kind of bring this back to the big picture of what we're doing here with the short-term rental policy. And I think one important place, less so maybe for the committee members, and more for the benefit of some of the public that have joined us throughout the course of our discussion, is to just kind of step back to why are we discussing the short-term rental policy. And the committee members know very well that this is something that came out of the housing summit that the mayor organized last summer, which was an opportunity for the city to come together with a number of community members and stakeholders to talk about the long-term kind of housing challenges the city has been experiencing, efforts that are underway or have recently been done to address them, and to identify a short list of items that we could continue working on in the short term to help us continue to make progress. A lot of the work that we talked about in and around the Housing Summit centered on the continued implementation of the Housing Action Plan, which is something that the City Council adopted in 2015. And I know throughout the course of this discussion, people have raised questions and concerns that, you know, we can't consider short-term rentals in isolation, and that we have to be able to make progress on, you know, creating new housing units or addressing the issue of the impact of the institutions on our housing stock. And I think the reason why we wanted to share a really quick outline of the types of issues that that housing action plan and that housing summit addressed is just to assure people that, you know, we aren't having a conversation about short-term rentals in isolation. And we really are considering both the issue of how short-term rentals interface with our housing stock, as well as any policy changes we might make to it in the context of other housing work that the city is doing. So just a quick reminder there. And this is the third of three zoning related amendments that this committee has been working on as a result of that housing summit a year and a half ago. They've already completed their work on ADUs and on parking reform. And you know, we've been working through the short-term rentals over the course of this year. As a reminder, this short-term rental policy includes three pieces, and I think it's helpful to just revisit how those three pieces relate to this committee's role. The first is, you know, or are a series of changes to our zoning ordinance. And that is the main reason why this joint committee has been working together, because these two committees have a major role to play in any zoning amendment that the city considers. So the bulk of what we've been talking about in terms of our short-term rental policy is a zoning change. There is a complementary policy piece that we've been including in your packet that we haven't talked about as much, but is relevant, especially to the Council Ordinance Committee members' purview, which is a few changes to the minimum housing code, which would create the dovetail with when an inspection or when a rental housing permit would be required for short-term rentals. And then the final piece, which we've talked about a lot, but is actually not really within the purview of this committee, is the idea of some kind of a fee on short-term rentals. This conversation has evolved a lot, which we'll revisit a little bit in the course of discussion tonight. But any recommendation around the idea of a fee or the purpose of a fee that this committee wants to make is just that. It's a recommendation to the City Council, which they would consider in a separate action. So not something that we would necessarily hash out as part of this meeting. As we all know, we've been trying to find balance in what sometimes seems like pretty competing goals related to regulating short-term rentals. In the resolution that referred this item to this committee, we understood that our charge was to create a regulatory framework that recognizes different tiers of short-term rentals, tries to limit the number of housing units that are converted to short-term rentals, and in doing so provides some flexibility for homeowners, generates some revenue for our affordable housing efforts, and recognizes that some short-term rentals benefit the city's economy. So we've talked in past meetings about how, depending on how much we turn each of our regulatory levers, we can kind of affect one of these goals more so than others. In thinking about how we generally limit the number of short-term rentals, that's what a lot of our conversation has been about over the last year. The original proposal included 3 strategies that would help us limit conversion. The first was limiting the number of short-term rentals on a property. The second was requiring that a host live on the property in all scenarios, which is where we started with this conversation. And in some cases, we considered certain types of short-term rentals to either be a commercial or a conditional use, which would give us some additional regulation around them in terms of how or where they might be allowed to locate. The committee has taken a tremendous amount of feedback from short-term rental hosts about the unique scenarios and ways that short-term rentals manifest themselves, and as a result has made a number of changes to the original proposal that you received. Those changes primarily include lowering the limit on the number of short-term rentals allowed in a multi-unit building, at the same time allowing some flexibility for a host in a multi-unit building to live off-site. Changing our perspective on how we thought of short-term rentals in terms of them being really a special residential use rather than a commercial use, and therefore changing the requirement that housing replacement would be applicable to certain short-term rentals. And then considering more of these scenarios by right. So not requiring a discretionary review by the DRB necessarily if people are creating short-term rentals. So we identified then at the end of our discussion that there were really kind of 4 main points here, and we'll get into talking about each one of these a little bit, but you all had asked for some additional background information to help us just navigate our discussion, particularly in terms of how short-term rentals relate to the city's overall housing stock and housing trends that we've been experiencing. We did include on the website and sent to you, I think as part of your packet, a link to a collection of slides that we've used over the last year. And those slides did include an update and where applicable new data that we have available to us about short-term rentals. So I don't want to dwell on these for too long, other than to say, you know, we've heard a lot anecdotally in terms of what the impacts have been on short-term rentals as a result of COVID. We know that people may not actively be renting right now. They may be renting for different durations of time and may be delaying making any kind of decision about their short-term rental until much further down the road when we know more about how the pandemic is going to resolve. But from our perspective, when we look at the total number of short-term rentals that have been reported to us in Burlington, we have seen a small decline in the total number since earlier in 2020, but nothing substantial. So from our perspective, what we think that means is that, again, while people may not actively be using their short-term rentals, it doesn't mean that they've been completely removed from the Airbnb platform, for example, and that they've made any definitive decisions today about how to use it in the long term. We have provided some other additional information, and we can answer some questions if you would like about short-term rentals, if there's anything there that you want to recap. We did provide tonight, though, some additional information about the city's housing stock, which is related to some questions that you all asked at the last meeting. Some interesting points here, I think, to just help kind of put into context the different types of short-term rentals that we've been discussing and how they relate to those types of units within the city's housing stock overall. So you can see in this chart on the left, this is data from the US Census. That's an estimate of the housing units in Burlington. And it's actually conveniently kind of broken down into similar categories of property types that we've been discussing as part of our scenarios. So you can see that single unit properties in the city, about a third of all of the city's housing stock, a little more than a third of all of the city's housing stock, are in single family properties. But what is unique about those properties is that those single-family homes make up about 80% of all of the owner-occupied properties, or owner-occupied housing units in the city. Duplexes are a type of property that we've talked about a lot in this committee's context. Duplexes make up a smaller wedge of our housing stock kind of overall, as well as a smaller wedge of our owner-occupied housing units and our renter-occupied housing units. They're an important part of the housing stock at 13% of all of the housing units, but just a smaller kind of wedge overall. And then finally, our multi-unit properties. Half of all of the housing units in the city of Burlington are in multi-unit buildings. And we also know that almost 75% of all of the rental units in the city are in multi-unit buildings. So kind of at the opposite end of our single family homes, this makes up the bulk of our rental housing stock in the city. There were some questions about trends in terms of vacancy rate and housing growth. These are some data points that were shared as part of the 2019 Housing Summit and some of the follow-up meetings that happened as a result of that. We've talked about this a lot, but just to kind of recap is that in the past few years, we have seen some positive progress in terms of some of the housing trends that we watch in the city of Burlington. Housing vacancy rate being one of them. From the 5-year period from 2006 to 2011, and then 2012 to 2008, we did see a significant increase, a doubling of the city's annual apartment vacancy rate, which is something that we use to measure how much housing is available within our community. But I think it is important to remember that that vacancy rate doubled to still being at 1.5%. And Burlington's vacancy rate has chronically been under 2% for many, many years. That's something that a lot of people have brought up as part of our short-term rental conversations. It's true, this has been a stubborn challenge for us to be able to bring our vacancy rate into a more healthy number. But it is notable too that Burlington's vacancy rate continues to be lower than that of Chittenden County as a whole. From 2012 until late 2019, we saw a growth of about 930 housing units in Burlington. And the graph on the right side of the screen helps to break down how those housing units have been built. So whether they've been built as a requirement of the city's inclusionary ordinance, whether they've been built by nonprofit developers like CHT or Cathedral Square, or whether they've been market rate units. So just to give you a little perspective there. But one thing that I think is important to mention here is that most of the recent housing growth and all of the anticipated housing growth that the city is expecting have been in multi-unit rental housing. So that is, when we talk about, kind of how much of the city's housing stock is in owner-occupied or single-family homes versus duplex versus multifamily, it's really that multifamily category where we've seen the most growth and where we see the majority of the potential for growth, housing growth in the city. So I think somebody asked last time, looking down the pipe, what do we see in the queue? There's a short list here of some of the projects that we know of that we are expecting to see. A little over 100 units that have received zoning permits that either haven't been built yet or haven't been made available for occupation yet. There are a number of applications that are pending. I do think it's notable that the vast majority of the housing units in the applications pending are related to City Place. And then when we look a little bit further, projects that haven't applied for permits yet at all, purely speculative at this point, include 200 more housing units at Cambrian Rise, and about 100 more or so housing units across other projects in the city. And then one other trend that the committee asked us to look into was just how residential property tax rates have been changing over the last number of years. We weren't able to get this data going all the way back, 25 years or so, which was what was requested. But we have been able to provide it for the last window of time that's comparable to some of the other statistics that we shared. Just showing how the homestead and non-homestead property tax value for a home, say at $250,000 of valuation, assessed valuation, has been changing over the last about 10 years. So that's the end of the kind of background information, Andy, that we wanted to share. And I think the first question then is really to get into some of the questions that the committee had raised during the last meeting about who the host is and when the host is required to live on the property as part of this scenario. I know that we've had some conversations about this issue over a number of our meetings, and I think it's helpful to kind of come back to the big picture of why we care about the host in the context of short-term rentals. You've heard a lot of feedback about who the host is and when the host is required to live on the property, but the main policy objective from the perspective of what we were originally giving to you, the reason why we proposed requiring the host to live on the property was primarily a tool to help us limit the number of short-term rentals that could be, or housing units that could be converted in the city. There were some other benefits, like, you know, we thought that it could be an important element to help with neighborhood impact. We've heard a lot about the tools to help manage short-term rentals, but this has really been about limiting conversion. We've also talked a lot about, you know, or we've talked a lot in more recent meetings about who the host actually is, whether the host is allowed to be an owner or a tenant of the property. In the proposal that we originally shared and that is currently drafted, the host is defined as either an owner or a tenant of the property where the short-term rental is located. And again, the primary reason for this was just to have a host on the property, again, to help us limit conversion. We do understand that a lot of people have expressed their concerns that, you know, it's pretty widely believed that few property owners will let their tenants host a short-term rental on their property. But the perspective of staff was just to let the lease figure out that kind of permission, and for us not to discriminate against who a host might be. So there have been some questions then about, you know, how do these two issues, how important are they, and how do they work together in terms of the overall impact on how many housing units in the city can be short-term rentals? And I think that this relates back to the overall housing stock in the city, some of that information that we shared with you just a minute ago. These two questions, when the host is required to live on the property and who the host is, could really be considered to be two levers. These levers could be moved, tightened or loosened, independent of one another, or in conjunction with one another, depending on what the committee feels like it wants to be able to achieve in terms of those policy goals that we were given. So we've illustrated the impact of turning these levers in terms of what it would mean in how many short properties would be able to have short-term rentals. And we wanted to just highlight those for you and then leave it open for the committee to have a discussion about. The current proposal right now, again, allows either an owner or a tenant of a property to be a short-term rental host and requires that host to live on the property for single unit and duplex properties, but allows them to live off the property for multi-unit properties. We've talked about this a lot, and I think when we look at both the total number of housing units that are in these types of properties, and then how many are owner occupied versus renter occupied, we can understand kind of the relative impact in terms of how many properties could be allowed to have a short-term rental. So the way that we have outlined this today means basically that most single unit properties could host a short-term rental. There are some notable exceptions that you've heard about, but there are, you know, most single family homes would be allowed to have short-term rental. The way that we've outlined this, most multi-unit properties can also have a short-term rental because we allow the host to live off the property. And under the scenarios that we've currently outlined, duplexes can have a short-term rental if the host either lives on the property or allows a tenant to be their host. Now, if we start to look at how we turn these levers, the first lever would be to look at where the host is allowed to live, whether the host is required to live on the property or not. So we make no change to who the host is. They can still be an owner or a tenant. But in this kind of alternative, we've said all properties have to have a host living on site, or I'm sorry, can have a host living off the property. So you did hear some questions about this in your last meeting. Would we consider allowing off-site hosts for single-family homes or for duplexes? This is kind of one end of the policy spectrum for you to consider. So if we were to make that change, if we were to allow hosts to live off-site in all scenarios, this means that who the host is has absolutely no bearing on whether or not a property can have a short-term rental on it. What it means is that the limits to the number of short-term rentals by property is our main mechanism that we can use to control the number of units that are converted to short-term rentals. So if we were to make this change, it would have, very little impact really on the number of single-family homes that would be eligible to have a short-term rental in them. There would be, a couple and some cases that you've heard a lot about that would become eligible that aren't now. But it would overall not have a dramatic impact on the number of single-family homes that could have a short-term rental. It could, however, create the potential for off-site owners to use single-family homes as short-term rentals. There would be virtually no change to what's allowed for multi-unit properties, and it would make it easier for someone to have a short-term rental in a duplex. Another way that we could turn the levers here is to look just at who the host is, but make no changes to when the host is required to live on the property. So there was a question or a suggestion at the last meeting about whether or not we should require the host always to be an owner of the property. So this essentially illustrates what would be the impact here. Again, for single-family homes, that would have a very minimal impact on the number of single-family homes that would be allowed to have a short-term rental. There would be a small number, that 12% of single-family homes that are renter-occupied that would not be eligible to have a short-term rental, even if the owner wanted to allow their tenant to do it. And there would be little change to when a short-term rental would be allowed in multi-unit properties. The big change here would be that most duplexes would not be able to host a short-term rental if we made this change. And that's because about 85% of housing units that are in duplexes are currently renter occupied. Did that change? That did change. Okay. The next kind of turning of these levers would be to look at when, if the committee wanted to require the host to live on site under all circumstances, under all of the scenarios that we've talked about, but we still allow the host to either be an owner or a tenant. Again, this change really wouldn't have an impact on single-family homes. It would have a big impact, though, on multi-unit properties, mostly because if we required the host to live on site, it would essentially require that, in order to have a short-term rental, a tenant was the host of these short-term rentals. And it really wouldn't have an impact on what's currently allowed for duplexes. And then the final scenario is just if we turn all these levers both the other way, or turn both these levers all the way the other way. The host is always an owner and always required to live on the property. Again, very little change to single-family homes, but it would prohibit short-term rentals in most multi-unit scenarios and would make a majority of duplexes incapable of hosting a short-term rental. So that's a lot of data, and that's a lot of kind of turns and levers. So we're happy to revisit any of these, but I think we just wanted to share that to give the committee something to think about in terms of kind of wrestling with these two questions of should offsite hosting be allowed in any scenario, some of the scenarios, none of the scenarios, and who is the host and why. So I'll I'll stop there, Andy, and let the committee discuss these two questions.
Okay, thank you. Lots to take in. What do people think? Alex?
Megan, would you mind just recapping those, like in 30 or 45 seconds, the 4 different levers? I mean, I think I really appreciate the way you lay this out.
Yep. So the levers are, again, the levers are if the host lives on the property and if the host is the owner or not.
Right.
So the first one is that we don't change our host definition, so they can be a tenant or an owner, but they are allowed to live off the property for any short-term rental scenario. So the major change here is that the host requirements have no bearing on this anymore, and we rely solely on the limits on the number of short-term rentals. The next is the host is required to be the property owner, but we make no change to when they're allowed to live off the property. This would primarily impact duplexes and prohibit them from having short-term rentals.
Could you go over that point? I don't quite follow that.
Sure. So under this change, so what we're looking at in this table is really this row that it indicates housing units that are in 2-unit buildings. So we see that 84% of our housing units that are in duplexes are currently renter occupied.
Okay.
So, oops, I think I changed the slide here. There we go. So if we require the host to be the owner of the property, rather than allowing the host to be the owner or the tenant, that means that because the vast majority of housing units in duplexes are not owner occupied today, they wouldn't be able to have a short-term rental unless they became owner occupied.
Megan, just for
Yes.
definitions, so we understand, when you say a duplex being owner occupied, are you saying like there's a duplex, there's a house that's 2 units. If the owner lives in 1 unit, are you saying that the building itself is owner occupied or just one of the 2 units is owner occupied?
In that case, just one of the 2 units would be owner occupied, but under the short-term rental scenario, we would consider that to mean that the owner lives on the property.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Just wanted to make sure we were clear on definitions.
Yeah.
Emily, did you have more questions on that?
I have a comment.
Okay.
So this is really helpful information. I also want to propose for thought that this is approaching it as in these numbers are constant. So that 84% of duplexes are fully rented, are not owner occupied. So I would propose to think of it as, well, what do we think is going to happen to duplexes if it's possible that if it was owner occupied, that you could do a short-term rental in the other unit? I think that it's going to encourage more owner occupied duplexes because there's going to be an opportunity to make quite a bit of revenue off of the other unit. So I don't think I view this as this is the set number of units that will be allowed, because I actually think that it will move the market quite a bit if this is allowed. And I've used the single unit detached dwelling as an example also. So you have a single family home in Burlington, and let's say it sells for $400,000. And so your mortgage on a $400,000 home is going to be something like today $1,200, $1,300 a month. Well, you could rent that, if you can rent that owner occupied home for $5,000 a month on Airbnb, when that home goes on the market, the new value of that home is going to be something more like $600,000 a month. So changing the ability to rent short-term rentals changes the value of a lot of properties and creates incentives for owner occupancy. So I think that if we make these changes, you're going to see these numbers move a lot. And I think you're going to see them move in the direction of more short-term rentals because people are going to choose to live in owner-occupied units and buildings because they're going to be able to short-term rent if they are owner-occupied.
Jack? Oh, Megan, did you have follow-up?
That's okay. Go ahead.
I just had a follow-up question and then a comment after that. So just to drill in on that, so for the duplexes, the 2-unit, 84% of them, neither unit is has
Right.
the owner.
So I think it's really important to caveat this information that we're not looking at the property level. We're looking at all housing units that are in this property type. So in the case of duplexes, for example, there are 2 units on every property. We're looking just at the total number of housing units that are in duplex properties. So 84% of housing units in those types of properties are renter occupied. I don't have a number in terms of how many properties with duplexes on them have an owner living in either unit.
Got it.
If that's helpful.
Got it. Okay. And so what we're talking about though with the regulation, just one more question, is when we say on site, or the owner has to live on site or the host has to live on site, we mean the host could live in either unit.
Correct.
And still Airbnb the other unit.
That's
okay.
correct. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, and then my comment is the next slide, I think, the second to last one would definitely be, host is required to live on site in all scenarios, but it could be a renter or an owner. That would be, for me, my preferred way to go about this, because I think that minimizes the negative impact, and it also spreads out the opportunity for people to benefit or profit from this down to renters as well, although the landlord could still prevent them from doing it, but at least gives them the opportunity to do it while also limiting folks who own, multiple buildings, or they live in one building and they own another building. This scenario inhibits their ability to make money to some extent, but it also limits the amount of rentals that are converted. And I think in a city of 60% renters, we have to prioritize that over, the fortunate few who own multiple properties, them maximizing profit. I don't think we can prioritize that over, renters' ability to find housing and find affordable housing. So for my part, I would prefer this scenario.
David, did you have a comment or something?
Yeah, just briefly, I think Emily makes an important point that you do have to think about, okay, so what might be the implication of such a change, and that if 84% of the duplexes are renter occupied today, and they could be converted to an STR if the owner lived in one, you're then losing half of the number of units in every situation. So, the renters are displaced, an owner moves in, and the other one becomes a short-term rental. So, kind of have to be sure to be thinking about, yes, these numbers are going to change. The market's going to drive it one way or the other, and is it driving it in a direction that we want it to? I think to Jack's point, if the host can be both owner and tenant, that reduces has the potential to reduce that impact somewhat.
Well, just one thing about changing whether it's owner occupied, a particular unit is owner occupied or tenant occupied, they're both providing housing for people that need housing, whether you own or you rent. So in that sense, it's not taking off necessarily the housing stock in the unit that somebody is living in. But
right, it's the other
I
one.
think all those points are well taken.
Another question, just in terms of, I guess, playing out to this being an implementation, what are the kind of mechanisms to monitor the tenant host function? Because I can see it being very easy to see if the owner is host and that being something that you verify. But, you know, even if you have a tenant, you know, for a year and then maybe that tenant moves out, what's kind of our ability to continue to see that last piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as part of when I mentioned earlier that the complement to the zoning changes is the minimum housing code requirements, one of the things that would be required for short-term rentals is that they register annually for a rental housing permit. And that would give us the opportunity to identify who the host is annually as part of that application for that permit. I know, for example, one of the other short-term rental ordinances in Portland, Maine that has been referenced before, they actually have, a form that gets filled out where the property owner designates a tenant who lives on the property as their host, and that gets submitted to the city.
Thank you.
You set, Soraya?
Mm-hmm.
I saw Alex and Chip. So Alex,
I just wanted to thank Megan for that great presentation, and just to point out that so we have 17,000 housing units in Burlington. 60% of them, those are rental units. 60% renter occupied. Well, basically, 400 units is 2.3% of our housing stock. So any change in that number has a significant effect on our vacancy rate. And so I think this is a pretty decisive moment for our city, and we have the opportunity to basically continue to try to chip away in small degrees and make it a more equitable housing market for the 60% of people who are renters here. So I would definitely argue in favor of scenarios that require host or tenant living on site.
Chip, did you have?
Yeah, I'm struggling with the assumption or even believing that having a tenant as a host is a likely scenario. I mean, every lease that anyone looks at has a preclusion, on assignment or sublease without the landlord's consent. So I'm not adverse to it, but I don't place much stock in the ability for tenants to be subleasing as Airbnb hosts. I mean, I don't know that moves the needle one way or the other, but I'm a little reluctant to spend an inordinate amount of time going down a path that I think is extremely unlikely, just given the way landlord-tenant relationships exist. So.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely something we've heard a lot of, both in terms of feedback from hosts and feedback from, renters, that they don't really see that as a very likely option that will be exercised. I think that from the perspective of some hosts, it could, we've heard from some people who have long-term tenants, for example. In some cases that we've heard from people whose long-term tenants actually help them manage their properties. And so there could be potentially some situations where an owner might designate a tenant like that to be their host of their properties, the short-term rental on their property. But it definitely is a concern that we've heard a lot of people express.
My only other comment, if I'm still have the floor, I'm less concerned just personally about I think we have means of getting at limitations through the number of units as we get into three and more units. We put clear limitations in terms of how many in a certain building. I'm less, if our concern on single family and duplexes, which I think is a legitimate policy objective, is outside parties realize that it's far more profitable to, buy a house and rent it out as an Airbnb forever, which takes it out of the housing stock. I have less of a concern, or use for the required owner occupancy as we get into 3 units or more, because I think we have another lever to deal with that, which is limitations on the number of units within a building, that can be converted.
Thanks. Emily.
Just a question, a clarifying question. When we talk about tenants being hosts, I think there's two different things we're talking about, right? We're talking about the ability for a tenant to rent their own apartment and make the money for themselves, right? And then we're talking, about the owner of the building. On the other hand, option 2 is the owner of the building being able to designate a tenant as their owner, as like their proxy owner occupancy host, and run the entire building. Because I'm not sure we're all saying the same thing. Like I wouldn't support allowing somebody to serve as the proxy, but I do support a tenant who has to be out of town, or a student who's not going to be there for the summer, with the landlord's permission, being able to sublease, in essence, their apartment.
In either case, well, yeah, let me think about that just for a second, because I'm not sure how we would make a policy distinction.
I just think, regardless of the merits of a policy like that, I think trying to enforce it one way or another to understand it would be really difficult. To look at this tenant is being a host because they're choosing to be a host, and this tenant is being a host because the landlord's asking them to be a host. I think that's trying to get to a level of detail that probably zoning can't really deal with very easily.
Andy, I don't know if you saw it, but Eves had his hand up.
No, I don't.
Here, I will, I'll stop sharing my screen for right now while you're having this discussion to make it easier. Eves, if you want to go ahead and speak.
Thanks, Emily. I think, I'm sorry, thank you, Megan. So back to Emily's point, Emily, I kind of get where you're going. I think that when you said sublease, for a student to go away for the summer and try to sublease their apartment, that's one thing. I don't necessarily see that as a short-term rental. I think what we're trying to get at, I think, is the idea of a tenant, whether they be a student or, having the ability to sort of cash in on their apartment or their place by having a bedroom or having part of it sort of or leased out. And I kind of agree with Andy. I mean, and I'd like to get back also, just while I've got a minute, to what Chip had said. I'm very personally, it's just me, but I'm very comfortable with the idea of short-term rentals in, single family homes or in duplexes. I'd probably even say triplexes, as long as they're owner occupied, because I see that as a way for people to try to supplement their income or find a way to pay for things around their house that they're having difficulty with right now. The challenge is when you get into tenants having the ability to rent a house that they've rented. That's the kind of thing that might lead to speculation and abuse, at least in my mind. But I think that, if somebody is going away for a summer, for instance, and has 3 months, that would be a sublease, which would be with the landlord's consent and with the landlord approving of that tenancy and that tenant. I'm done.
But that 3 months is not a short-term rental, just to be clear. Short-term is 30 days or less.
Right. Sorry. So I'll jump. So that's my point. I think, David, is that we're, if somebody is gone for a period of 2 or 3 months, that's a sublease. It's not a short-term rental. Short-term rental is, as you said, 30 days or less.
There are.
Yeah. Go ahead, Emily, and then Jack will go after you.
Right. So you're a student. You're going to be gone for the whole summer. I'm not saying that you sublease for a 3-month to one tenant. There are tons of people who are managing short-term rentals right now. So you could give up your apartment to someone who's managing a short-term rental and have it rented for short terms for a week at a time for the entire summer and make a ton of money. That is the peak time for short-term rentals in Burlington, is the time when students go away. So I don't know what the solution there is, but I've always thought that there is some untapped supply in the city for the summer months when I know in my neighborhood, the neighborhood is empty because a lot of people leave town. So maybe it's just too granular and we don't need to get into that policy stuff, but I do think it's a possibility.
I just want to make one comment, and Jack will go to you. Emily, I think that's, in my mind at least, why we want to have the flexibility for the, the owner occupied, the single unit or the duplex, because, it could be that instead of renting to somebody for a whole year, the student for a whole year, you only rent to them for the 9 months. And then you spend the summertime or a different, part of the season doing a short-term rental. So, it could be where it's the tenant in there, it could be the owner doing it, but it's giving that level of flexibility. So that way, parts of the year, it can be the long-term and parts of the year, it might be the shorter term, but it's giving the flexibility to be able to go back and forth to meet what the needs are. But just wanted to comment on that. Jack, and then Zariah, I see your hand up, so you can go after Jack.
Yeah, I think others have gotten at this as well, but I definitely don't want to create sort of a, in my mind, sort of a loophole scenario where you're basically just designating a tenant in order to, host people somewhere where you don't live. Like, that's not at all my intention or where I was at when I was giving my input earlier. What I'm thinking is you have a renter who leaves town for a short period of time and can go on Airbnb. I think Councilor Mason's right that like most landlords aren't even going to allow that. So it's, we shouldn't oversell the benefits of that. But I do think some landlords, especially like tenants who've been in the same unit for 2, 5, 10 years, which I know a number of those folks, and have those relationships with their landlords, I think, the landlord would let them Airbnb for a weekend in many cases. So, I mean, it's not a huge number of people, of renters that would necessarily benefit, but I think there's a number. But I don't want this sort of, I'll throw like a designated host on site and then rent out 4 other units in that building, because I think it should be the unit that you actually live in that is their it's your primary residence that you're going out of town and you're Airbnb-ing it, not I find one person who's a tenant to be the host for a 10-unit building, and because they're the host, it's fine. So I hope that's clear, but I think we need to sort of distinguish that to the point that others have raised.
Yeah, that helps to clarify the kind of point about the issue of tenants hosting. I do think that it almost sounds like that's like a hybrid of what a couple of different options that we talked about before, which is, it sounds like you're suggesting maybe that the tenant has to be the owner the host has to be an owner, unless it is a tenant that's renting their own unit, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, sort of the way I look at it, and I raised this on the other side, on the owner occupied side as well, is like it should be the primary residence,
right,
in my opinion, that's being Airbnb'd. So if someone owns a house in Burlington and it's their summer vacation home that they live in for 2 or 3 months a year, that to me is also somewhat problematic. They're going to Airbnb it for 9 or 10 months a year. For me, that's not really the intention either. And similarly with a renter, like I think it should be their primary residence that's being Airbnb.
right. Yeah, and the way we've been talking about primary residence is by using the on-site versus off-site. So that's the piece that we've been talking about, is that the host living on-site means that the property is their primary residence, right?
Right. And I don't want it to be, there's a one tenant in a 10-unit building who now is hosting the other units are Airbnbs and stuff like that.
Understood. The one only other, sorry, Scott, I feel like I'm cutting you off every time you're opening your mouth, but I don't want to lose this train of thought. One thing to just add here in terms of talking about tenants and people's ability to kind of rent intermittently is just a reminder that in our zoning ordinance, you know, anything that happens for less than 10 consecutive days or 30 total days out of the year is exempt from needing a zoning permit anyways. So if we're just talking about somebody who leaves for one weekend and wants to Airbnb one weekend, that's fine. Like this, we're not really talking about that scale of short-term renting in this framework that we're contemplating.
Thanks for that reminder. Yeah, that's a good point.
Scott, was that what you were gonna add? Sorry.
I was gonna make the same point about the temporary bar, right? We're talking, you know, just for the weekend, doesn't really matter. It's actually up to 30 days within a year. You know, I think it adds another nuance to what we're talking about, moving towards more complexity, but I think it's also a fairly simple nuance. You know, I think basically we're talking about setting the bar as the owner being the host, owner occupancy, by and large, with an exception for tenants, with part of that caveat being in tenant cases, to address Emily's concern, it needs to be the tenant's unit that's being STR'd, and that would tap into the tenant being gone for the summer, for instance, and STRing it. I think that would avoid the scenario wherein the offsite property owner simply designates one of the tenants, right? I think that closes that loophole. So I think it's a fairly simple fix, but it is an added layer of complexity to what we're talking about.
Thanks. So I think next we have Zariah, then I see Emily and Harris. I think I saw you raise your hand, but I'm not sure. But okay, so Zariah and then Emily. Thanks for your patience, Zariah.
Yeah, actually, one, also want to thank Megan for putting up such a great framework. It's hard to make a decision by committee, so it's helpful to have such a great decision-making framework. And then I was going to speak on other points, but I think they've been resolved already. I think I'm less concerned about short-term rentals over the summer. That seems like an acceptable thing to me. If there's lower demand, that it's kind of filled by you know, other uses instead. The other thing that I was going to say is I do think that this is a good framework. I think part of for me, part of the decision making about how limited or unlimited we make things ends up being another conversation that I think we still have open in terms of the fee and or the housing replacement fee and or the percentage fee that we're thinking about putting this on, because to some extent how much I could see like this being a driver for like undoing some of the harms that short-term rentals can cause ends up informing how much we should limit it or not, if that makes sense. So if, you know, the fee is pretty high, then it feels like we don't need to limit it that much because it ends up really paying into the Champlain Housing Trust and other kinds of mechanisms that can help that. And so I think this is a great decision-making framework. I think it's a little hard for me to decide until we've also finalized or have that conversation. If that makes sense.
Thanks.
Agreed.
I think Emily is up. Megan, did you want to?
No, sorry, I forgot you had mentioned Emily. Go ahead.
Thanks. Something that was said was that you can, by Scott, was that you can rent up to 30 days in a year and not be considered a short-term rental. So 30 unique days, like you could do 30 or let's say 15 weekends and still not be considered a short-term rental?
Yeah, there's totally separate from what we're talking about here in the zoning code. There's provision for temporary uses, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's STR or anything else. And that allows 30 days within 12 months and up to 10 consecutive day increments. So you could do that as a bunch of weekends. You could do that as a few separate weeks. Yeah, 30 total.
And it's not that we wouldn't consider it a short-term rental, because like if they earned income from a short-term rental, they would still be required to pay the taxes on it. It's just that we wouldn't require them to obtain a zoning permit for it if they're renting it that intermittently.
I know that tax law says that you can it's actually a tax loophole created for a golf course. Surprise, all the best tax loopholes are. But you can rent your house for 15 days and not actually have to pay any taxes, income tax on that rental. So I just think it's really interesting that you can rent up to 30 days. And I wonder if that is actually something more people need to know about, because there's a lot of peak weekends in Burlington that, like Marathon, back in the old days, remember that? We used to have events like the Marathon, Beer Fest, all of those great events that we used to have, where all the hotels fill up. And if more people took advantage of these 30 days that they can do without a permit, without any fuss, I think it actually might reduce some of the loads on the hotels and help our community. So I didn't know that. Thanks.
Yep. Andy, Eves also has his hand raised.
Okay, Eves?
Hi, Andy, thanks. I guess, you know, I'm hearing all this and I feel as though I'm not sure if we're talking for the same purpose. And I feel like there's two purposes we need to identify here. You know, one is, are short-term rentals having an impact on the housing stock and the stock of available apartments, available rentals for long-term renters? That's one issue that I think is an important one and one we should address, and I think there's ways to do it. But the other issue is, and Councillor Hightower, this kind of goes to the idea of a fee. I've raised this again. There are a lot of people who own property in Burlington, and by property, I don't mean people who own multiple properties. I mean people who live on their property and are having a hard time paying the mortgage and are having a hard time paying the taxes. And we need to enable them to have the ability in their own property to supplement their income by choosing to do short-term rentals if they want. And I think that if you charge a fee, a housing replacement fee, you severely limit the ability of, I would say, 95% of those people to do it, because the very reason why they are looking to do a short-term rental is because they need the money, which means they don't have the ability to write a large check, and especially in this pandemic. And so I think we need to do two things. We need to protect the ability of the tax-paying citizens in Burlington to be able to generate revenue if they choose to have a short-term rental on their property. And I say that whether that be a single-family home, a duplex, or even, again, an owner-occupied triplex. But I agree with you that when it comes to the larger issue of people saying, well, hey, I'm going to monetize this apartment and I'm going to rent it on a short-term rental basis annually, that is speculation. That is something that drives the price of housing up. That is something that does not benefit the community. And there, I would say that if that is a choice, then there should be a fee, because that is a choice that you have made to financially monetize your property in a different way as an investor. But I do believe that when it comes to the owner-occupied short-term rentals, it should not be a fee. It should be a percentage or tax that is added on to the nightly rate, because essentially what you are asking then is not that the homeowner, the taxpayer, pay that fee. The fee is passed on directly to the user where it should remain. That's it.
Thanks, Eves. And I think we'll be going into that in more detail. That's one of your three issues, Megan, that you have on your list. Yeah. So I think, Eves, I think you made a good distinctions there, and I want to hold off on a fuller discussion of that. You know, we'll close off the host issue, and we can try and move to that issue that you've talking about next, even.
So I just want to check in with where we are. So I've heard a number of committee members indicate that their feeling about these questions around the host, these two tools that we have around the host, are, I want to make sure I'm feeling out the consensus, that we prefer that the property is the host's primary residence, and that in most cases we've been talking about the host being the owner of the property, with some limited exceptions for tenants as a host. But I want to just make sure that I'm clear that that's how this committee's feeling, because that is a departure from the direction that the committee gave us earlier in its work, especially around multi-unit buildings. So I just want to make sure that that's what I'm hearing that correctly.
I think that there might be a distinction, although I'm not completely sure from the discussion. I think there might be the distinction between like the single unit or the duplex, maybe even the triplex, as opposed to the larger units. If I think what I'm hearing is that for the smaller units, there is more of the desire for it to be the owner occupied, or perhaps a tenant tenant occupied if it's their own unit. For the larger units, I don't know if we've been talking about the ones that are in structures of, the 4, 5, 6 units, and however many units we allow it to be a short-term rental. I don't know if that's what the discussion is really focused on that we just had. Am I saying that correctly? Is anyone disagreeing with what I just said?
Not that disagreeing with what you said, but how you said it, because
Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm quite clear on what you said, but what I think that there should be some room for people who live in single family houses. Say, well, we've heard a number of scenarios of people who are saying, look, I just have one property or 1.5, housing units, or people who want they're relying on this income to stay in their houses, is basically
Right.
that end of the scale. I think it's fine. I don't think
Right.
we're placing
For the small end of the scale, for the single dwelling unit, the single detached unit or the duplex, maybe even the triplex, that the owner of the building can provide the short-term rentals. It has to be the owner of the building on site, or it could be a tenant in one of those. In the larger structures, we're saying, I think a tenant could be, a tenant could do short-term rentals for their own unit, but we don't necessarily want them to do it to manage that building, if you will. But I don't know that we've really honed in yet on, for the larger buildings that have multiple units. We'll be talking about it. We have talked in the past about how many units can be short-term rentals in and of themselves. I don't know that we've really focused in on whether the owner of the whole building needs to be in that building before they could do something like that. I think on the larger ones, we've really focused more on just the number you could even have in the first place.
Right. We did talk about we've always talked about those scenarios as buildings with 3 or more units in them. So it sounds like maybe there's a new distinction kind of emerging here, where we think of 1, 2, and 3 unit buildings as more alike than buildings with 4 or more units in them. But when we have talked about those multi-unit scenarios, those 3 or more unit scenarios, we did talk about both the limits and when we thought the host needed to live on the property. And I think the prior direction that we'd gotten from the committee is that that was the one scenario of all the scenarios we talked about where the committee was okay allowing the host to live off of the property. So if we feel like we need to make some nuance around the 3 units, that's definitely something that we can clarify. That's part of the reason why we're having this conversation. But yeah, that's the main reason why I'm asking for this clarification, because it is very different from what we've talked about in the past.
So the focus right now from what you're asking is for the larger unit buildings, either 3 or 4 units or more, whether the host needs to live on site.
That's correct.
That's the question. Okay. Soraya?
Yeah, and again, I feel like I'm not quite as opinionated on this until we've decided some of the other things, but I wonder if a good compromise that's not so complicated to explain may just be that a tenant can host 1 unit. So if they live in a duplex, it could be the other unit. If they live in a multi-unit building, like only one unit per any building, whether it's a duplex or a 7-unit building, can be hosted by a tenant. And so I don't know, again, going back to like the regulation questions, if that's easier or difficult to determine, but I think that might get at, one tenant doing several different units, but doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in their unit. It could be in their unit, or it could be, you have a 5-unit building, they live in one of the units, and one of the units is a short-term rental with the tenant.
I think the main change from where we are today with that idea would be that in the case of buildings that have like 7 units or more, for example, where we would in theory allow the tenant of a living on a property to be the host of a short-term rental, you're suggesting that they would only be allowed to do 1 rather than 3, which is what the proposal would currently allow for.
Well, that a tenant can, I guess that's just getting at the question of, I wouldn't want to disallow it, period. I think is maybe where I'm getting at. So it's like, if the owner's not on site, but you still want to have one of the units be a short-term rental, you can partner up with a long-term tenant to have them do that 1 in-unit rental. If that's where the committee was going generally, is in trying to limit it, I feel like that's a way to limit it without disallowing it in large buildings, period.
Megan?
Saying, Soraya, sorry, I'm looking to get this straight in my head. So are you saying in cases of multifamily buildings where the owner lives off-site, the tenant, in that scenario, would a tenant have to be a host and it would be limited to 1? Or are you saying something a little different?
I think that's what I'm saying, but that could maybe be because I wasn't following where Jack and some of the other commissioners were going in terms of how much we want to limit it.
Let me do this. Megan, could you just say again what the current standard that we've developed is for the larger buildings, the 3 or more or 4 or more units, both in terms of number of rentals or short-term rentals that would be allowed in there, and what the host needs to, what the owner needs to do, whether they need to live on site, not on site, or the tenant. If you could do that, and Jack, I see you've had your hand up. So let's just have a reminder of what our current proposal is that's in front of us right now, and then we could go to you, Jack, as we hone in on this issue.
So your current proposal for multi-unit properties, so 3 or more units in a building, allows 1 short-term rental in buildings of 3 or 4 units, 2 in buildings of 5 or 6 units, and 3 in buildings of 7 or more units. And for all those, regardless of the number, the committee gave us the feedback that they wanted to allow the host to live off of the property.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the reminder of where we were. Jack, I think you're up.
Yeah, no, and I think for my part, like earlier in the process, as we were talking about this, I think I was getting very much caught up in the weeds to the point where I didn't zoom out. And now I feel like the more that we've done that and we are kind of zooming out a little bit, I personally don't actually support what Megan just described in terms of where we are. Like, I don't think someone living off-site and owning a building of 4, 5, 6, even 3, even 2 should be able to do Airbnb. I think the owner should live on site. Like, I don't think it should be you designate 1 tenant to be a host and then you have Airbnbs. So even for a duplex, like, I wouldn't want them to, someone owns a duplex they don't live at, I wouldn't want them to do 1 tenant in 1 unit, 1 Airbnb in the other. I don't think we should allow that.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this one?
I mean, maybe we can come back to this question at the end, because it sounds like some of you have suggested that you would like to hear about some of the other issues or talk through some of the other issues first. But we do want to come back to this as a staff because it could potentially be a pretty significant shift. So we want to make sure that we understand where the committee is with this.
Okay.
Can I speak to just one of the nuances that I hear in all of this
yes,
too?
David.
So you've got the owner, and we've talked about a tenant, and somewhere in this conversation, there was the idea that the tenant could host their own unit with permission of the property owner, of course. is that kind of a middle ground to some of this? That so your duplex or triplex situation, you know, the tenants there could be hosts to their own unit, you know, within the limitations of a partial unit rental, but not a whole unit rental.
Well, it could be a whole unit, David, right? You would simply need to remain the host's primary residence, right? Whether it's the owner or.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that a tenant, you know, if I'm renting an apartment or renting a place, that, you know, with the landlord's permission, I should be able to go away some weekends and do short-term rentals of my
Right.
place, even if it's for 35 days of a year, you know, to capture some of those, you know, peak times. And
Right. I think though the kind of change that I'm hearing doesn't really it doesn't center on the tenant issue and whether or not the tenant can either be the host or is allowed to host their own unit. The change that I'm hearing is about whether the host has to have their primary residence on the property, regardless of who they are. That's the kind of shift that I'm hearing and part of this discussion from our prior discussions that I want to just clarify. So
I do think, Megan, from what you said before about going over the other ones and then circling back to this question might make sense. I saw, Emily, you had your hand up. Did you want to chime in on something?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on what Eve said earlier, which actually struck me as a good way of approaching this. That if you are not, what I understood you said, Eve, was that if you're not an owner-occupied person, that you should have to pay the full housing replacement fee. And I think that might be a way to approach it. Because one thing that crosses my mind is that in some instances, someone could change the use of their building, right? So you have a single family home and you change it to a bed and breakfast. And that's allowed if it's allowed in the, you know, zoning area that you live in, then you would have to pay a housing replacement fee and you would get to change the use. So I'm wondering if that's a way we could approach it too, that, you know, if you have, you know, breaking it up into units. So if you're removing one unit from the housing stock, that you pay the full housing replacement fee. So I'd be interested in exploring that more.
Why don't we, Megan, does it make sense? I know you have 3 different ones listed. The next one on your sheet was the limits of STRs on depending on the building type, but there's been a lot of interest on the fees, which is your 3rd item. Does it make sense to jump to that one?
yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. Can you see my screen? Can you all see my slides that I'm sharing?
Nope.
Oh,
Not yet.
that's because I didn't share it. Sorry about that. I'm looking at the slides, but you can't see them. Okay, there we go. So I think it is helpful to, and I don't know if you had a chance to read the memo that we shared with you in the packet for this meeting, but I think it's helpful to just go back and talk about why housing replacement was part of the conversation here. When we were originally presenting the short-term rental proposal framework to this committee, there were some short-term rental situations that we were categorizing as a commercial use rather than a residential use. The housing replacement fee standards in our ordinance are applicable when any kind of residential unit or use gets converted to a commercial use. So that is the main reason why housing replacement became part of this discussion. We didn't kind of lead from the perspective in developing this policy that housing units should pay this, you know, big fee as part of being allowed to do a short-term rental. It was really kind of a function and an evolution of how we considered short-term rentals to be a commercial use. We heard a lot of reactions to this idea, both in terms of just reactions to the idea of how much the fee could be, but also a lot of conversation from hosts about the fact that sometimes the circumstances around short-term renting are much more fluid than thinking about converting a housing unit to a cafe or an office space, for example, where you lose the physical housing unit. It's no longer easily able to be reoccupied as a housing unit. In the case of short-term rentals, that's not the case. They are still, in most cases, configured as the housing unit that they were before they were being used for a short-term rental purpose. So the committee really wrestled with this issue a lot, of the fact that, you know, housing replacement isn't really applicable, not because we're like worried about the amount of the fee, but more because it just doesn't fit with the nature of what short-term rentals are and how they might become a short-term rental for a period of time and then go back to a long-term housing unit. I remember one of the things that this committee discussed was the concern that, you know, if we were requiring this housing replacement fee to be paid up front before somebody could establish a short-term rental, there was a concern that that would actually work as a disincentive to them ever converting that housing unit back to a long-term rental in the future, because they would have had so much invested in getting that permit in the first place. So through the course of that discussion, as we kind of understood that any fee that was generated as part of a housing replacement would have the benefit of supporting the Housing Trust Fund, we heard a suggestion from a short-term rental host about this idea of a nightly fee, and we started to really feel like if we're going to collect revenue to support our affordable housing efforts from short-term rentals, we should think more along those lines than along the lines of, you know, categorizing short-term rentals as commercial uses and requiring housing replacement at the outset. So I think it's important to remember that, like, the proposal that we have right now for 99.9% of short-term rental scenarios actually would not require housing replacement. So there were some questions about, you know, how much is the fee? How is that generated? We tried to provide some of that information in the memo to you. But I think it's important to remember that right now, the way this is structured, housing replacement actually doesn't apply to any of the scenarios. So the question about fees then really comes down to, you know, what is the purpose of a fee from this committee's perspective? Is the purpose of a fee intended to dissuade somebody from converting a housing unit into a short-term rental? Or is the purpose of the fee to help generate some revenue to support the city's affordable housing efforts, which is, you know, through the Housing Trust Fund in some way? As I said at the beginning, I think that understanding that this committee really only has purview over whether or not housing replacement applies via whether a short-term rental is considered a commercial use or not. The limit of our discussion really is like, what is the purpose of that fee? But ultimately, if there is any kind of fee, it will be up to council to find an action that will support a rate of fee and a form of fee that achieves that policy objective that this committee feels is important.
And if I could just add a couple of things to that, you know, the fee that's generated today through the housing replacement fee, you know, it's not like it's financially, it's generating enough revenue in order to replace that unit in whole. You know, it's still a relatively small number relative to the cost of building a new unit. It's a subsidy that gets added to how we subsidize for the creation or long-term retention of housing. So that's kind of one piece of that. And the other, I would encourage you to think of this in terms of, take the fee off the table for a minute and make sure that the policy does what you want it to do on its face, that your regulations are saying we want these types of activities to occur in this way in these places. Don't try to use the fee as a lever to force things one direction or not. We use the fee as a mechanism to help offset some of the impacts relative to the potential loss of housing. But when we look to derive money through a process like this, I think it creates a number of problems in actually getting us what we want.
And the one final point, sorry, the reason I said 99.9% of the scenarios that we've talked about wouldn't require housing replacement anymore is because the committee was still of the opinion that if somebody has a building and all the units in that building are short-term rentals, we do consider that a commercial use. We would call it lodging, and any housing unit that's in that building that's being converted to a short-term rental would pay a housing replacement fee as a result. So that's the only kind of circumstance, that scenario 6, that was all the way at the opposite end of the spectrum, where we were considering housing replacement to still be applicable.
So let me just weigh in and then I'll go to the others. I mean, I think especially for the smaller buildings, for the owner, single family house, for the duplex, maybe even the triplex, I think it's important to allow those to be fluid, to go back and forth between, you know, the owner lives there, they may rent out a piece of it for a longer term, they may do short-term rentals, but to be able to go back and forth. And if we start charging housing replacement fees for something like that, I think it could really backfire along the ways that you were just describing, Megan and David. You know, we talked a little bit before about doing the summer, you know, somebody lives there during a school year and wants to do Airbnb during the summer. You know, they should not have to pay a housing replacement cost to do Airbnb for a few months of the year when they're going to be going back and forth. So allowing that flexibility, I think, could actually provide a lot more opportunities for housing for people when you give the smaller units, the smaller property owners, the ability to do that. I think as you get to the larger ones, it may be more appropriate, you know, in the larger buildings with more units, and it may be when they convert the whole thing. But I think especially for the smaller ones, we want that flexibility to allow people to go back and forth between the two, or all sorts of different things to meet their needs at any particular moment, and not lock them in or out of any of the scenarios. So that's my view. Soraya, I see you. Yep.
Yeah, I actually, I think I was less against it. I was fine with it not needing to be owner occupied, but I do actually really like Emily's idea that short-term rentals for non-owner occupied dwellings do pay the replacement fee. I think, because I think it does have more of what we talked about with like converting the whole, if somebody has a multi-unit building that they're, you know, have 2 or 3 short-term rentals, and that does sound like it's starting to be an investment property as opposed to with commercial use, and that they're kind of making a long-term plan to have that be a short-term rental, and that it's less likely to have that same kind of, oh, maybe I'll switch, that you might have for an owner-occupied duplex. So I think that might be a good compromise between totally flipping to it can't be owner-occupied versus it must be owner-occupied versus it doesn't have to be. And then the second thing is, in another meeting, Megan, I think you had said that a 1% increase not the housing replacement fee, but going to the tax, I don't know what that, but the 1% increase means that the annual revenue would go up about $150,000. And I guess, no?
No, it was, so I was using the amount of money that we've collected from the city's current tax on short-term rentals, which is a 2% tax.
Mm-hmm.
So we've generated a little over $100,000 in the last fiscal year from that tax. So half of that, 1%, would be around $50,000 a year.
50,000. Okay, yeah. My apologies. Yeah, and then I think, okay, that's lower than I thought. So I guess with that, I would want to not, again, I think we don't want to go with a housing replacement fees for all of the reasons stated, and it's a clunky mechanism that goes against some of our goals. But I guess I would want to know, in terms of deciding what that amount is later on, I guess I would want to know a little bit more about how quickly, like what percent we'd have to put it at to get and this may not be a calculation we can actually do, but to get a like rate of payback for what the housing replacement fee would have been. Like if it's a 5-year, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And I think Jennifer actually asked this question at the last meeting. And I did talk to her a little bit after the meeting to try to better understand the question, which was basically like, could we look at a comparison between what housing replacement would have generated versus what a some percent fee would generate? And, you know, We've talked about this and looked into it a lot, and it's actually in a lot of ways comparing apples and oranges, and is actually very difficult to compare, because I think the other thing that we're not talking about the kind of complete picture of how housing replacement impacts properties. So there are certain types of residential properties that wouldn't be required to pay a housing replacement fee even if they're converted. Owner-occupied properties don't have to pay it. So we don't know necessarily if we were to apply this, how much money could be generated from the housing replacement fee, because we don't know all of the details that we would need to know about existing short-term rentals in the city, nor do we know how many might want to be a short-term rental knowing that they would have to pay that kind of fee. On the other hand, we would be making a lot of assumptions that post-COVID rate of short-term rental usage is going to be the same as it was pre-COVID. Like, it's really hard for us to do that kind of comparison with what we know today.
So one way to get, because I do think it'd be helpful to have a sense in terms of policymaking, even if it is apples and oranges. And this is just an idea, but one way to do that might just be to say, okay, what is the housing replacement fee for a 2-bedroom? So not trying to figure out the whole market, which you're making so many assumptions that I see that it would be really hard to do. But if we did a 2-bedroom apartment, and what is like an average 2-bedroom apartment's, the housing fee replacement, and then what is the revenue of an average 2-bedroom apartment, and how long would it take to get to that housing replacement fee? So doing kind of like what we did with the scenarios, doing examples as opposed to trying to compare what the market would be under the 2 different things, may at least give us a sense of what kind of revenue we're generating. And sorry, I know a bit of a tangent, but I do think it's relevant.
The cost of building a new housing unit is much higher than what we have contributed to the fund on the yearly basis. Emily, do you have that number? Is it like $400,000 or $500,000?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. And I think what Zaraya is hitting on is I've been thinking the same things. Like we have, let's say we have 400 units that are Airbnb units right now. And let's say it takes $100,000 for the housing trust fund to build a new unit, and these are not even close to how much it costs. If you're generating $100,000 a year in Airbnb sales tax, it's going to take 400 years before we're able to build the number of units that we've lost. Losing 400 units is a lot of units. And I mean, that's $40 million it would take for the housing trust fund to be able to build that number of units. So I do think it makes sense to look at the numbers and try to have the numbers come into some reasonable understanding of the loss of units in the city. I did want to call out, there's a comment from William Gagnon that said, why not have large yearly rental registry fee? Burlington already charges a yearly rental fee just to make it more for short-term rentals. This is what Portland, Maine does. So I didn't know if anybody had information about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that was what I was kind of getting at with the question about what the committee's perspective is on this fee. We had promised that we would complete our research around this issue of the additional increment rooms and meals tax. Kim has done that for us. It looks like we are using our full authority at this point. So any kind of fee that the city might ultimately choose to levy on short-term rentals, if it's, a tax-based fee or some kind of nightly fee, the council would have to pursue a charter change to, indicate what impact it thinks it has and what the applicable fee might be. There could be a path to go through rental registration fees that would also be set kind of in a different forum than this conversation. But I think from our perspective, what's important to understand is, is the purpose, because we're still kind of talking about 2 different things here, and maybe the answer is both, which is fine. But I think the question that we have is the purpose of the fee, is in giving direction to the city council on considering this issue, is the main purpose to be a deterrent to converting housing units to short-term rentals? Or is the main purpose to be to substantially support our affordable housing efforts? And I do think it's important to note that in very few circumstances is the Housing Trust Fund ever used to fulfill the entire cost of building a housing unit. It's
Never.
always
I
used.
say never.
Yeah, I mean, it's used to either preserve housing units as affordable, it's used to give grants to organizations that build affordable housing, it's used to, you know, subsidize the cost of a project. Like, we're never talking about a fee that is the full replacement cost of an entire housing unit. So
Well,
it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think for the smaller ones, the primary goal for the fee would be, you know, funding for the housing replacement costs, or or something like that, but not so much as a deterrent. I think for the larger ones, where you have a large multi-unit building that we may not want to have so many units converted, even though we already have a limit on number of units. In that situation, though, we may want to start using it to be another deterrent to converting it to short-term rentals. But I also think one of the challenges with that is we seem to be okay with the idea of somebody renting for 9 months of the year and then letting it be an Airbnb for 3 months. So sure, does that mean only a tenant could do that? Suppose the tenant says, I'd really rather only rent the place for 9 months, but hey, landlord, you could Airbnb it for another 2 or 3 months. So, if you charge a housing replacement cost of multi-thousands of dollars, either they won't do that, and so they just won't do that, or if they do that, they won't turn it back to be the 9-month rental out of the year that somebody may want it to be. So I think it may be that when we go to the housing replacement cost fee, that we're really looking at those buildings that are being converted from any kind of the rental unit just to like a hotel, basically.
Right, which is how the proposal really would work right now.
Anyone else? Okay. So are we wanting any changes from the way that it's currently structured in the draft? Sounds like then we're okay with the way it is. Jack?
I mean, I still hold the position that I said earlier in the meeting, which would not be to keep it the same, but that's just for my part.
Yeah, what are you looking at it as a nuance between smaller and larger, or just across the board?
Well, so I guess what I was trying to say earlier is I think the owner should have to live on site, and with potentially this exception of the tenant and the tenant's primary residence, and sort of if the tenant's there 9 or more months of the year, for example, but otherwise, requiring the owner to live on site. And also, I wouldn't want it to go above, if there's more than 4 units, and I think it should also be 4 units or less, basically, that we should be allowing. So if the owner's on site, but there's 15 units, that to me is different than owners on site. It's a triplex.
Megan, even in the largest buildings, would we ever allow more than 3 units to be used as the Airbnb?
No, under the current proposal, whether there's 7 or 70 units in a building, 3 is the max in a building.
Any other thoughts here? Emily?
I think I agree with Jack that I don't support it being allowed for non-owner occupied or full investment properties. And I'm open to discussing, in the chat right now, I know Earhart said that he would support a replacement fee along the lines of what Eve's commented before, and charge a tax or fee based on the short-term rental revenues and dedicated to the Housing Trust Fund. So thinking of that more as an impact fee. So I don't support it as it's written now, but I'd be open to discussing a way to allow fully, investment properties to have Airbnbs if they're paying in some sort of comparable to the housing replacement fee. And I think that discussion needs to be had about what that fee is and how we compute it. I think that allows flexibility for people who are, investors and non-owner occupied to allow Airbnb, but it's a deterrent from changing over units that would be part of the housing stock to being Airbnb units.
And full disclosure, I know in a lot of meetings in the past, I've tried to keep up with the chat to help keep you informed of what's going on. I have not been able to follow it tonight.
The chat is great.
So I don't know anything that's happening on the chat right now. I'm sorry.
If members of the committee are not following the chat's really interesting to follow, and it's great how it doesn't disrupt our conversation, but there's some great ideas happening over there.
So, I mean, Andy, if you want, we can take the feedback back from the committee and look over what's being suggested in the chat, and we can follow up on it. It sounds like there are a lot of ideas that have been put on the table that, staff can kind of talk through and maybe think about how to provide you some direction on in the future. But I don't know if you want to continue to discuss these questions at this point or not.
I think that would be great if you could do that. Take what we've said and try and, put a recommendation or proposal together from that, if you can. I think that might help give us a little bit better guidance on just how. I think we're at the point where we're trying to refine some of this, and I think that would be really helpful. Are others in agreement with that? Okay. Bruce?
I think David's comment on the purpose of the fee would be really important for us to get some consensus around, because if you're thinking about the fluidity back and forth, if the fee is substantial and that it's designed to prevent movement from one sort of use to another to short-term rentals, then that's one purpose and would dictate maybe a different fee structure. And I'd also like to comment on that. If you did that and an investor decided to amortize that, then they create a whole new debt structure, and it makes it difficult for it to be ever moved backward, maybe for 20th back to a housing unit for 30 years or so until that debt's paid off.
Well, let me try taking a crack at summing up what I think I've heard. And this may, Megan, you may use this or not, depending on whether I get nods or not on this one. I think what I'm hearing is for the smaller units, the single family duplex, as long as the owner lives there, that it's okay. And that there's not going to be the housing replacement cost. There may be a nightly fee or something like that, but the owner could be there. And that's fine. I think we haven't yet refined exactly what a tenant can do, although in a tenant, they could be in their own unit and turn their own unit into an Airbnb for some parts of the year. On the other side of the scale, for the larger units that there's no owner occupancy in it, I think what I'm hearing is that those are the ones that we really do want to limit as much as possible, and that having the housing replacement costs for those larger units is something that people are more interested in doing, because that will, one of the main reasons for that is, number one, folks are still wanting owner occupied, the owner to be there, and in the larger ones, the owner typically is not there. And number two, that's turning it more into a commercial property. And so housing replacement is more appropriate for something like that for the larger ones. Is that the gist of what is coming through in all this discussion? Harris?
I think that's good. I would just maybe add something in terms of the purpose of the fee. In my mind, is to help with housing replacement and not have a full housing replacement fee. Having said that, it might not make sense to have that fee for a room in someone's house that they're renting out as a short-term rental. Because in a lot of cases, that's just using excess capacity someone has in their house, and it gives them income, and that's not inhibiting any other housing or rental. I don't think. They might not want to do a long-term rental there, but they're okay with renting out that extra room here and there. So. If we talk about a fee, in my mind, it's to help with housing replacement.
Thanks. Soraya?
I just want to clarify, because we keep talking about it's okay for tenants or owners, like in unit. As it is right now, we're saying any host who has their primary residence, it's not really, there's no limit. We're not like, as it is right now, that's already allowed, right? That's not a new.
Can you clarify what you mean by allowed? That somebody
Yeah,
can have a
we're
short-term
talking a
rental?
lot about tenants and or owners and in-unit things and wanting to like make sure that that's not as regulated. But right now, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as it's in unit, it's not regulated the same thing as a separate unit being rented. There's no.
So we don't make a distinction between in unit versus separate unit. We make the distinction based on whether the host has their primary residence in the same building as the short-term rental. And that's important because of things like the duplex scenario, or somebody that has a 3-unit, even if it's owner occupied. Like, it needs to be in the same building as the short-term rental. So currently the way that the proposal is structured is that if the host lives in the building for a single family or a duplex scenario, they could do a short-term rental. They do not need to live on the property if they are doing a short-term rental in a multi-unit building, which is we define as a building of 3 or more units.
Okay.
That's the way your proposal is currently structured.
Sorry, I was misreading something on the chart as I'm trying to lean in and read it. And then the second question as to the point, I agree that to the point that we can move away from the housing replacement fee, the better, except in instances where it does feel like it's actually moving from a long-term to a short-term more permanently, which to me would be the non-owner occupied. And then the impact fee, I don't know if we're talking about the purpose of that as well, but to the point that we can mitigate the impact of that, I think the better.
Yeah, I think, I am seeing a little bit, like, the chat is kind of blowing by me. The term impact fee is being suggested here. Vermont has very specific standards around impact fees, and I do not think that we would be able to charge an impact fee on short-term rentals under our statutory authorities. I think the intent of what people are suggesting there is that the fee is based on the impact that the short-term rental has, and so maybe they're calling it that, but I do think that it's important to just make sure that we're not confusing that with our statutory authorities.
I think that's right. And I think also in thinking about any sort of fee and how it's structured, that it's equitable, it's proportional across the different types of units that you may be applying it to. And, there's some rational basis for it. We're not just charging an exorbitant amount of money because we're trying to generate money. That's not the kind of purpose of this process. So it needs to bear some relationship to something.
So I'm mindful of the time. It's almost 8:40, and I think people are expecting, because we told them they'd have an opportunity to do a public forum on short-term rentals after our discussion tonight, so we could hear from them if they want to chime in, which may help, since Megan and David and Scott are going back and going to do a little bit more work on this. may help with that as well. So I think as our group, we need to wrap up our discussion, start wrapping up our discussion for tonight so we could hear from public comment. So I don't want to cut anybody off though. If you have last minute things, Emily, I saw you raise your hand. So if you want to go
I
ahead.
just had one thought that I wanted the committee to consider, which is there's a lot of conversation about the revenue that allowing short-term rentals allows for investors in our community, and how they won't be able to break even unless they can do a short-term rental is some of the narrative that we're hearing. I just want to offer that if you are an investor and you own a building in Burlington, it will increase your revenue. However, if you sell your building, the value of your building is going to be more. And the next person who owns that building is probably going to make the same cap rate that you made when you weren't able to do short-term rentals, because the market is going to determine the rate of profit of all those buildings. So allowing short-term rentals for investor properties here is going to have a financial benefit for one generation of property owners in the city until they sell their buildings and realize the increased profit from allowing that increased revenue. It's not going to pass on to the buyer of the building and make it more profitable to own that building, because the buyer of that building is simply just going to pay a higher price.
Anyone else before we go to public forum on this? Megan, David,
No,
Scott,
I
do you have
don't
any last minute thoughts before we go to public forum? Okay, so let's do that. And at our next meeting, we'll have more, Megan, David, Scott will come back to us with some proposals based on what our discussion was tonight. So Megan, do you want to go through the public forum, folks? And thank you all for being patient tonight. I can't see any of you. If any of you are on video, I can't see any of it. So Megan's going to go through that. I will say, just if you can be a little mindful of the time, and I'm not sure how many people want to speak, but we just want to make sure people could speak tonight.
Yep. So the first person is Eric Hanley. He contacted me before the meeting. Eric, you should be able to speak.
Okay, can you hear me, Megan?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Eric Hanley. I've spoke before, and I know a lot of you guys on the committee. So I have a place on North Union Street that I used to live in. I bought the property about 30 years ago. It's a 2-unit. I have a 1-unit, a 1-bedroom there that it's a long-term rental. In the 3-bedroom, I use as a short-term rental. I always had a hard time renting that place, and I have other college rentals, and I didn't really want to make that into a college house. And I don't want to make that into a college house. So someone suggested to me about 1.5 years ago, why don't you try to Airbnb that? I have a lady that'll be a super host, Susan. And so right now it's an Airbnb. I employ 4 people, her and her 3 kids. They're graduated from college. They all have jobs, and they do all the cleaning fees, which is attached to all the Airbnbs. So it's a little extra income for them. So, and I pay meals and rooms taxes. In 2019, I think Megan said in the last meeting, it was $104,000. So where's that money going to go if, everybody has to live at a short-term rental? It provides people to stay, and as people saw on the chat that I chatted there earlier, typed in, my first couple from when COVID opened up in May, it was an older couple. This lady needed chemo treatments at the hospital, and I'm 1.5 miles from the hospital. They couldn't stay in a hotel and stuff. They were here for 5 weeks, and they loved it. My biggest concern is just this duplex issue, having owner-occupied units. So if I had to be owner-occupied there, you would lose the long-term renter there, and in my case there. So I'm just, that's my scoop there. And, it's a nice property there. I don't really want to turn it into a college rental and stuff. And it's a nice Airbnb. And I think Airbnbs are a big part of downtown Burlington now. Thank you.
The next person is Jamie Sharp.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Jamie. Go ahead.
I just have kind of a generalization of, attending these meetings for over a year. I feel like, I know everyone's probably exhausted, but as a host specifically, it's exhausting listening to these meetings because of the repetitiveness. I think Megan and Scott have put together a really good proposal looking at the committee members and the host members and everyone's point of views. And now I just listening tonight, we're backtracking, a lot of discussions we've already had. And I think there's a few new committee members that might not have heard all of our stories and all of our, I'm not going to speak to our specific situation, and I don't think every host needs to repeat all of their specific situations to you, because you've heard that. And so I just think it's just this overall kind of frustrating feeling that we've already talked about whether it should be a host primary residence or not. We've already talked about the housing replacement fee or not. And so and as a host, going through COVID, already taking a huge loss this year, I think we're just exhausted. It is fluid. We are, you go from being short-term rental to a long-term rental. And then I also just want to point out that you guys keep talking about it being 3 to 4% of our housing units. It's not. It's 1.6% of our housing units. 410 units you have, 71% of those are whole unit properties. So that means 30% of those are people's couch, people's bedroom within their own home. So it just gets a little frustrating sitting here listening to, oh, this is 3 to 4% of our housing unit. It's not, we need to really, and even that 1.6% could be someone renting out their house for the 30 days a year. We don't have that data to know that it's not. So anyway, I appreciate your guys' work. I just want you guys to know that as a host, these are our frustrations, and it's getting exhausting listening to these meetings. Thank you.
The next one is Amy Magyar. Amy, you should be able to talk.
Thanks so much. And I really am overwhelmed by the work that the staff has continued to do in terms of data collection. Tonight's extra data was really helpful. I think it brought to mind for me that I'm really struggling with why we are absolutely preventing no non-owner occupied single standing units. So maybe it's a single standing home that currently makes up about 30% of the overall units in Burlington. And if I read this right, about 12 or 13% of those single standing units are rentals, versus the multi-units that are making up about 50% of total overall units, where about 90% of them are rentals. If we are worried about units going from long-term rentals to short-term rentals, I'm flummoxed, as Paul mentioned in the chat, why we aren't being more harder on these multi-unit ones that are rentals that could turn over into short-term, versus the small amount that may exist in single standing homes where they're really only about 12% of the rental market. And so it's just really powerful for me to come back to, we want to prevent, I think every short-term rental host that has been here since the last year wants to prevent a developer from coming in. I think every one of us is like, heck yes, absolutely. But the developer isn't going to build a single standing, single home. That's not where the money on Airbnb is actually made, because those homes are rented far less than, let's say, a 1 or 2 bedroom condo / apartment. We may be able to get a little bit more money a night, but we don't have the same kind of population coming in for those larger homes. So I just want to say, if we want to try to limit the amount of short-term rentals that exist out there, we should really be looking at the ones that could be truly affected, which are the ones that are already being rented in terms of long-term rentals, and those being flipped, not punishing a single standing home. I just cannot put my head around that. But I don't want to sound too frustrated in the sense of, again, I'm in awe of the work that the staff has been doing and the committee's been doing debating this. Thank you for the time.
All right, the next speaker is Erhard Monka.
Sorry, that wasn't me.
Yes.
My dog definitely has an opinion on this.
What he said.
So, thanks, and hopefully he'll stay quiet. He's quite the loudmouth. Thanks for recognizing me and for the time. I'm just also awestruck coming late to this discussion is the incredible complexity of what you guys are considering. Not really having looked into this really since the housing summit. Andy, you're doing an amazing job leading this, and Megan and Scott, the information you're providing is awesome, and people's deliberations are really commendable. So, no surprise, I come from this, with my longtime affordable housing hat, not representing any coalition or anything, just as a longtime Burlington resident. And I come from the basic position that, as you saw from Megan's statistics, our market has been incredibly constrained for decades, literally for decades. I've been working in affordable housing in this area since the early 1980s, and there's really never been a time when we haven't had an incredibly constrained market. And in this market, even when the vacancy rate is as high as up to 2.5%, we're not where we need to be. And losing any of the multifamily properties, units in those to short-term rentals, I think it hurts the market. We have an intense and protracted housing crisis in the city and beyond. So that's my general perspective. Having said that, I fully understand, the good points that many have made, including Eve's, around the need to balance this with people's ability, with, many like moderate income residents to make it in Burlington and realize some income. So my focus really is on the multifamily properties that are over 4 units. And as I posted quickly in the chat, my position as a longtime affordable housing advocate would be that you really should not allow conversions in multifamily buildings that are over 4 units. 1 to 4 unit properties are classed differently, they're assessed differently, banks treat them differently. And when you get into 5 and above, you're talking about a different class that's largely an investor-owned properties. And I think that's where most of the danger is in loss of rental housing stock to short-term rentals. And that's where, the loophole that I think Jack, talked about, others talked about earlier, where, if you install a tenant that, is your host in a large multifamily property, they could be your property manager basically on site for a number of units. Sorry, the dog is probably not going to stop. He's pretty persistent. So my focus really would be to say, please don't allow really any short-term rentals in 5 units and above. So make it 1 to 4 units only, and then require owner occupancy, except in that small set of circumstances that I think Jack described earlier, where if a tenant leaves for a weekend or a couple of weeks and they have permission to sublet, that they could earn some extra income through a short-term rental. That's basically where I'm coming from. I do have a couple of just sort of questions, not to raise a lot of questions at this point, because I know it's late in the game, but I do kind of wonder, I haven't been following this very closely, but I kind of wonder if, has CHT or has Cathedral Square, have they kind of weighed in on this? I know that, just from some emails I've shared with Michael Monty at CHT, that I don't think he knows a lot about what you guys are considering. And I think there would be some concern from the broader nonprofit community around the impact as well. If they haven't already weighed in, I would say that they will probably be concerned and maybe might not wake up to this. They've all been dealing with COVID and the pandemic. They may not wake up to this until it comes to the city council and there's public comment there. Emily raised, I think, a really important issue around assessment and property valuation. And I really wonder, commercial residential property is valued based on its income potential. And if the income potential rate rises as a result of short-term rentals, how is that going to, have you all talked to the assessor? How are they going to be evaluating these properties that now have higher income potential? And is that going to be a shock and a surprise in terms of people's property taxes that they're owed? And is that going to be have a longer range deleterious effect on rising property costs when these properties are sold? So I think that's a really important issue, especially for the multifamily properties. And then lastly, I posted on this on the fees. I agree that the fees that have been proposed are not they're not going to replace an affordable housing unit. So I think that what you really should be doing is looking at some form of tax, maybe taking that portion of the rooms and meals tax that the city generates as a result of this, and then whatever other assessment the city council might add to it. I know you can't do that as a planning body, and have it dedicated to the Housing Trust Fund. I think that would probably be a simpler thing than exacting a large fee that is insufficient to begin with, and that's difficult for all but investor-owned properties to pay. So, thanks for listening, and appreciate all your good work and your continued deliberations.
Okay. Next is Paul O'Brien. Paul, are you there? Okay, we'll come back to Paul. The next one is Lucas Jensen.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. So I just want to speak up. I've been participating in all of these for over a year now, and I just sort of want to echo some of the exhausting nature of this and the frustrations of how we seem to be stepping backwards in the discussion, and that is even more frustrating to be sitting through. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact of why this committee. I think that, Megan, it was really nice at the beginning of the meeting today that you sort of brought us all back to what is it that we originally started off with, or that you originally started off with, the charter of this group right here, which was around this pressure on the housing market in Burlington. And, there's still really no evidence that short-term rentals are having any impact on that whatsoever. The fact that we're spending as much time as we are and as much effort is being put into this, that it's 1.6% of the current housing stock in Burlington, and it's not growing. It didn't grow this year, and it's a weird time with COVID-19, but I don't know, that it's going to take over and consume the entire market. It's not an easy thing to run a short-term rental. It takes a lot of effort. You've got to be way on top of your game. It's really important. You have to have good ratings. You need to make sure you have good guests. It's not something that you just sort of haphazardly go into, that it's a big commitment for someone to get involved with that. I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that many of us that have spoken in the past about short-term rental ownership, we're not doing this because we're trying to get rich and we're trying to extract all of this money from the Burlington community. We're doing this because it helps us make ends meet, that it provides us with a little bit extra income for sure, but that income is typically used to be put back into the market, whether it's employing other people, whether it's offsetting cost or rent that you would be charging to someone else, basically providing a lower income rental for other people, improving housing. It's just not to make a bunch of money. There's more reasons, and I don't want to lose sight of the fact of why we participate in this market. I guess I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to speak. I'm also, it has not been explained to me why a non-owner occupied 2-unit rental is different than a non-owner occupied 3-unit rental. And Megan, I've asked you that question a few times and I've still haven't gotten an answer to that. And there seems to be a big discrepancy in how this committee is thinking about those two things. From my perspective, I own several different kinds of rental properties, and there's really no difference between a 2-unit rental and a 3-unit rental, non-owner occupied. And it concerns me that we're delineating between those things with some of the things that are being considered here. I will leave it at that. Thank you all for your time and effort that you've put into this. I know that you're probably exhausted as well.
Okay, thank you. The next one is Paul. I'm not sure if that's Paul O'Brien or a different Paul.
Yes.
But, okay.
It is. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Megan, and thank you for giving me the chance to just talk a little bit about what my experience is. And I want to reiterate what many of the past hosts in the past 20 minutes have been talking about. It really is it's a confusing time to keep following this discussion, but I want to put in, and I know I've said this in the past in our discussions, that the short-term rental hosts and owners, it's not that we're trying to be a commercial operation. These are people. I mean, I've met these people. This is something that we're doing as supplementing our income. It's not like, I think we're being perceived as something that we're operating some type of a commercial operation. That's truly not the case. I think everyone has a different situation, but to be moving down this road at this time, it's really difficult. It's difficult to grasp the conversation and why it's going in this direction. It's, the data that you put forward, Megan, is outstanding, and I'm thankful for it. But I do think that there is a lot of speculation and a lot of forecasting that goes into looking at that data and what the housing stock is and what the impact of short-term rentals is going to be. But I do know that there's not speculation right now for what the impact would be on the owners of these places. I think it's the timing with COVID and everything. It's difficult to really look at what's going to happen with short-term rentals. But I think if there's any movement in regulating it, it's really going to have an impact on these owners. I mean, these are people, they're residents of the city, they're taxpayers. That's not a commercial operation. I really want to keep that perspective in the forefront of the committee's mind. And that's really what I've been reiterating before. So I'm going to keep it short. I've got the dog asleep, but the baby is not. So I've got to get running. And I really do appreciate all your work that you're doing behind this. So thank you.
Thank you. Andy, that's all that I see with their hand up.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all who stuck it out with us tonight and over the last however long, many months it's been. Really appreciate your comments. So with that, I think we will move on from the short-term rentals and look forward to I'm not sure if it will be our next meeting, but the next meeting that we discuss this in, we'll be able to pick this up on. So thanks again on all the discussion that we had tonight. So item 5 is our 2021 Planning Commission meeting schedule. That was in our packet. Do we need to approve that schedule?
Yeah, Andy, if I could just really quickly, for the council members that are here, if you wouldn't mind waiting just 1 minute so that we can talk about the schedule for our next meeting, that would be great. So yes, we do need to approve our meeting schedule, Andy, for 2021. We've proposed the dates that are consistent with your meetings in the past few years, 2nd and 4th Tuesday evenings. All the meetings right now are proposed to be virtual, and we will update the schedule with in-person locations when we are allowed to resume in-person meetings.
Okay. Any comments, or is there a motion to approve the schedule? Is there a motion to approve the schedule? Motion by Harris. Alex? Seconded by Alex. Any discussion? All those in favor of the schedule, of the motion to approve the schedule, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? Good. That's unanimous. Then thank you. Then we're on to item 6, which are commissioner items and discussion of our next meeting. Emily?
I have a procedural question for Kim. Since we're a joint committee, what are the rules around like talking to each other outside of this meeting? Because we're not all on the same, like not everybody's on the planning commission, some people are on the city council. So how does that work? I don't want to break any rules, so can you tell me what the rules are?
So it's joint committee. I think technically it's still the planning commission based. I mean, the votes are out of the planning commission for the like moving along the ordinance. I would still just go with the quorum number, so stay less than the quorum. So don't talk to more than 2 other people at a time.
Okay. That apply to the ordinance committee itself, so that, you know, a quorum of the planning commission and a quorum of the ordinance committee?
So we're not a special committee that has its own quorum, right?
I think that's true, but you know, so you can't have a quorum of the planning commission because these are clearly planning commission proceedings, but the ordinance committee's participation, you wouldn't have a quorum of the ordinance committee either. But you could have a mix.
So in other words, I couldn't talk with Councillor Hightower or Councillor Mason about this outside of the committee. Is that true?
I would think that would be a quorum of the ordinance committee.
So city councilors can't talk to any other, city councilors on this committee can't talk to another city councilor on this committee about what we're talking about, because that would be considered a quorum of the ordinance committee.
Right. But they could talk with 3 planning commissioners. It would not be a quorum of the
We're
planning.
a dime a dozen.
Right. I don't know. That's how I would look at it.
So the question that we had for the counselors that are still here, well, for all of you, is about our next joint committee date. So we have a planning commission meeting that is scheduled on December 8th. So I wanted to check in with this group to see if it would be possible for the ordinance committee members to join us that evening. We have a couple of other dates that we've proposed here based on the city council schedule, if that doesn't work, that we wanted to check on.
I think that works, or at least in terms of conflict with, I think the ordinance committee is scheduled to meet on the 3rd and the 10th. We have placeholder meetings. I don't have a conflict, but I know I don't want to speak for Councilors Hanson or Hightower.
Okay.
Which date are we looking at? I'm sorry.
I think the 8th.
The 8th? I'm open on the 8th.
I can do the 8th as long as it's at this time, the later time, the 6:45.
The 6:45.
Okay. So if the planning commissioners that are here are still good for the December 8th meeting at 6:45, then we'll plan on that being our next meeting of this joint committee. Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Good.
Okay. Now the counselors, we don't need you anymore.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Take care. And we only have a few minutes left for the commission. Any other commissioner items? Okay, then item 7 are minutes communications. Motion to approve the minutes and accept communications.
So
by
moved.
Alex, seconded by, who's going to second this? Harris. All those in favor of approving the minutes and accepting communications, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Right. Any opposed? That passes. And motion to adjourn. By Harris, seconded by Alex. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Perfect. That's unanimous. And we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving.